I always thought I knew where the limits of fear ended on the road, until the night I realized I was seeing the same woman standing on the shoulder of a deserted highway at different points, dozens of miles apart, without me having made any U-turn or crossed paths with any car that could have left her there. The third time the headlights outlined her silhouette, motionless and leaning as if she were waiting for me to pass, I understood that this trip was no longer routine and was becoming something much more dangerous. Either I accepted that something was profoundly wrong, or I pretended that nothing was out of place and risked discovering the hard way what the true price was for ignoring certain signs on the road. My name is Marcus, and I make a living transporting cargo along the most isolated routes in the United States. That night I was returning practically empty to the depot in Oklahoma after unloading in Amarillo. It was a stretch I had driven dozens of times, an endless line of darkness divided by a white stripe, a few rusty signs pointing to almost abandoned towns, and a silence long enough to transform any banal noise into a threat. Most truckers avoid driving there after midnight, not because of robbery, but because of the feeling of vulnerability that this type of road causes. The early morning was thick as ink. There was no moon, no stars, not even the distant glow of another lantern besides my own. Only the rumble of the engine and the steady vibration of the steering wheel reminded me that I was still in the real world. It's at times like these that the mind starts to invent company, and that's why many veterans say never to fully trust what you see in the early morning. But that night, the problem wasn't imagination. It was precisely the fact that what I saw was too clear. The first time we crossed paths was shortly after 1 a.m. My headlights outlined the figure of a woman standing on the right shoulder, perfectly still, with a loose dark coat that concealed the shape of her body. Her head was tilted downwards as if she were observing her own shadow, and her arms were pressed against her torso without any movement. The hood made her face completely invisible, a dark hole framed by the fabric. What really struck me, however, was the tear, a large irregular cut in the left sleeve of her coat right at the forearm, as if someone had violently pulled the fabric or as if she had been dragged by some sharp object. It was too strange to see someone there, alone, so late, without a flashlight, without luggage, without a broken-down car. Reflexively, I looked in my rear-view mirror as I passed her, expecting some gesture, a sign, anything. But she remained completely rigid, frozen, until she disappeared into the darkness. I tried to convince myself that if I found a gas station further ahead, I would notify the authorities. But the truth is, I just wanted to get away from that point on the road. It's amazing how some people, even when completely still, can give you the feeling that you've just crossed an invisible border. About 40 minutes later, the impossible happened. A light rain began to fall, transforming the asphalt into a bright, dark surface. The wipers traced rhythmic semicircles on the windshield when, on the left side of the highway, my headlights revealed the same woman. The same posture, the same coat, the same tear in the left sleeve. Her body rigid, without any reaction to the brute force passing a few meters away. I hadn't made a U-turn, hadn't entered a secondary road. There wasn't any point to cross to the opposite side until then. Even if there had been, that time interval wouldn't have allowed her to reach that place. And more, she was on the opposite side, as if she had been transported and repositioned with millimeter precision. I swallowed hard. I felt my hand sweat on the steering wheel. I tried to rationalize. Maybe it was someone else wearing a similar coat. Maybe the tear was a coincidence. Maybe sleep was distorting what I was seeing. But none of that held up. The repetition was too perfect. The position of the head, the rigidity of the body, even the way the coat pulled around the tear. Everything was identical. From that moment on, every kilometer became a kind of psychological test. I kept looking around, hoping she would reappear. The feeling of being watched began to grow, first in the corner of my eyes, then on the back of my neck, like a silent weight that couldn't be ignored. At 2:39 a.m., my headlights cut through the light rain and revealed the woman again. It was the third time. She was on the right shoulder again, a step closer to the white line, as if she were gradually advancing with each encounter. But the detail that truly destroyed any possibility of denial was another. Around her feet, the asphalt was completely dry. A few meters away, everything glistened with the drizzle. But beneath her, there wasn't a single spot of moisture. That's when I realized that what I was seeing didn't fit into any logic. The road was soaked, but it didn't seem to belong to that scene. It was as if it stood apart from the rest of the night. The radio, which I had turned off to avoid distractions, turned on by itself with a deep hissing sound, similar to dragging footsteps on gravel. The sound filled the cabin as if it were just inches from my ear. I pressed the button hard until the hissing stopped, and the cabin was silent again. Only the sound of my own breathing filled the air. A few kilometers away there was a gas station, and I decided to stop. Not because I felt safe there, but because I needed to get some fresh air away from the road. As I entered the forecourt, however, I realized there was no sign of life. The pumps were off. The convenience store was dark. No lights other than the dim, intermittent flashing exterior lights. It was as if the place had been evacuated hours before my arrival. The silence there seemed even greater. Even the engine's rumble seemed out of place in that environment. Then I saw her again, standing at the entrance to the courtyard, exactly on the only path to get back to the highway, as if she knew I had nowhere to go without passing by her. The tear in her sleeve seemed larger now, like a cut that opens when the skin stretches. Her posture didn't change. The hood didn't move. She was simply there, like an inescapable marker of a destiny I hadn't chosen. At that moment I understood that it wasn't by chance. The exact repetition, the strategic position, the absence of rain around it, the dead outpost. It was as if I had been led there step by step, from the very first appearance. My hand trembled as I engaged the gear. I needed to get out of there, but any movement made me feel exposed, as if something in the air was just waiting for me to be distracted for a second to get closer. Still, I aligned the truck with the exit. The closer I got to it, the more the coat seemed to absorb the light, as if it were made of some fabric that drank in the light instead of reflecting it. When I stood side by side just a few meters away, I felt the cabin change. It wasn't the wind, the temperature, or the engine vibration. It was something deeper, almost as if a new presence had been added to the cramped space behind me. The smell of the environment changed too, taking on a metallic note, like wet iron or old rust. I didn't look. I used every ounce of self-control to keep my eyes on the road. I was absolutely certain that if I looked away even a millimeter to the side, I would see something I shouldn't see, and I didn't want to know what was under that hood. As soon as I passed her, I accelerated until I felt the engine vibrate more strongly than usual. The road reappeared before the headlights. The white lines guided me like trails. But inside the cabin, the feeling that I was no longer alone settled like a damp weight on my shoulders. I drove until dawn without stopping, even refusing the need to drink water. I didn't turn on the radio. I didn't adjust anything. I didn't take a deep enough breath to release the tension for a second. The feeling was constant, silent, as if someone were sitting right behind the passenger seat, patiently waiting. When the sky finally cleared and I entered the urban area, the pressure inside the cabin lessened. It didn't disappear, but it dissolved enough for me to think more clearly. I parked in the depot and stood there for a few minutes with the engine off, just listening to the crack of the metal cooling down. Then I slowly turned to look at the entire cabin. Nothing. Everything was where it should be. My coat thrown on the bench, my bottle, my sleeping mat. No sign of dark fabric. No trace of presence. No physical indication that that night had been real. A few weeks later, I stopped at a roadside diner in another state. The notice board near the cash register was covered in messages, but one caught my eye as if it had been placed there just for me. It was a missing person poster. The photo showed a woman in a dark coat with the same jagged tear in her left sleeve. The notice said she had disappeared months earlier, last seen hitchhiking alone on a highway in a light rain. I stared at the photo for a long time, with the growing certainty that night I hadn't crossed paths with a lost woman 3 times. I had crossed paths with something that repeated her image like a mark, a warning, a passage. And the idea that torments me most is simple, direct, and impossible to ignore. If she appeared to me on that road, she could appear to any trucker, on any night, on any shoulder. And the next time someone passes by that torn jacket, they might not be able to keep driving until dawn. I've never been one to take trucker talk too seriously. Truckers invent legends for everything. Haunted gas stations, curves that spontaneously tip trucks over, stretches where the radio only picks up static. Most of it serves to ward off sleep, elicit laughter, and pass the time. But a few months ago they started talking about a specific place with a kind of silence I hadn't seen in years. It was always the same name, repeated in a lower tone, as if the word itself could bring trouble. Highway 47. I was at a truck stop in Indiana, late afternoon, checking tie-down straps and tire pressure, when I first heard about it. 3 older drivers, the kind who'd crossed the country more times than they could remember, were talking about trucks that had disappeared. Not overturned, not caught fire, not stolen, vanished. Tracker switched off suddenly. Last position always on a dark stretch of Highway 47. No skid marks, no parts, no bodies. Just absence. I tried to ignore it. The more time a guy spends alone in the cab, the more his head becomes fertile ground for this kind of thing. But when I finished refueling and climbed into the cab, I opened the company GPS to check the route. The fastest route option cut through that exact stretch. All I had to do was press a button. Staring at the bluish screen, I felt a kind of childish discomfort, as if I were about to do something I'd been warned not to do. I deactivated the fastest mode and left it on the main route, even though it cost almost 2 hours more. I thought the matter would end there. But the road has its own way of correcting decisions. 2 days later, in another state, I received a notification on the flight control panel. Serious accident on the interstate, total blockage, mandatory automatic detour. I touched the screen, opened the new route, and felt my stomach churn when I saw the layout. The alternative route descended through smaller roads until it inevitably led to Highway 47. There was no other option within the deadline. If I tried to invent a route, I would miss the delivery deadline and have to explain to the office staff that I was afraid of a yard rumor. It was early morning when the green sign appeared on the right. Exit for Route 47. Light rain, starless sky, faded horizon. I turned on the windshield wipers, downshifted, and entered. From the first few meters, I had the feeling that I had crossed an invisible boundary. The streetlights were more spaced out, casting yellowish patches of light that couldn't dispel the darkness. The vegetation on both sides seemed denser, as if the trees and undergrowth wanted to reclaim the asphalt. The radio started malfunctioning in a different way. It wasn't a gradual loss of signal. It was as if someone suddenly turned down the volume on the world. Stations that were playing music disappeared in a dry hiss. I tried changing frequencies, turned the dial, pressed automatic search. Nothing. Silence. Just the engine revving, the friction of the tires, and a low hum that I couldn't tell if it was coming from the cabin or from inside my head. I looked at the clock on the dashboard. It was a little past midnight. A time when I would normally be used to solitude, but this didn't feel like the same solitude as other nights. It was a different kind of absence, as if that stretch of asphalt had been isolated from the rest of the country. No lit farms, no fence posts with lights, no distant headlights coming from the opposite direction. After about 15 minutes, I saw 2 very faint red dots on the shoulder of the road ahead. They looked like the taillights of a parked car. I slowed down a little, preparing my reflexes for any emergency. As I approached, the lights became a little brighter, at the right height for a bumper. When the beam of my truck's headlights finally reached the spot, the dots simply disappeared. They didn't dim. They didn't blink. They went out. In their place, only asphalt, vegetation, and darkness like the rest. I drove straight past, trying to convince myself it was some kind of reflection on a sign, maybe some agricultural equipment, something like that. But the truth is, my body reacted differently than my explanation suggested. My hand gripped the steering wheel, my shoulders lifted without me realizing it, and my breathing became shorter. Those who spend a lot of time on the road learn to respect these kinds of physical signals, even when their head tries to play the logical card. A few kilometers ahead, I saw distant headlights in the same direction I was going. 2 white points vibrating slightly, forming the outline of a truck ahead. I was almost happy to see another vehicle. It's strange, but at a certain time of night, the mere existence of another headlight already feels like company. I approached. It was a semi-truck pulling a completely white trailer, without a logo, without a company name, without any identifying signage. It looked freshly painted, smooth, too clean for a road of that type. I kept a safe distance, observing. Strange. The truck was driving exactly at the speed limit, not a kilometer more, not a kilometer less. On slight curves, it didn't slow down at all. On slight inclines, it didn't lose speed. And what really started to bother me, at no point did the brake lights come on. No touch, no correction, nothing. It seemed like someone had put the vehicle on an invisible track. I looked at the GPS. The screen showed my normal position, followed the route, and outlined the road. But there was no indication of a vehicle ahead. In that system, when you get close to another truck with a tracker, an icon or something appears. There. Nothing. It was as if the road were empty. I craned my neck trying to get a better look at the license plate. By then I was close enough to see the shape, but the part where the numbers would be was covered in a uniform layer of dirt, as if someone had applied darkened paint. Everything was very clean in the truck bed, yet dirty in the only part that could identify where that truck was from. Just another detail that added to the discomfort. I was about to begin the overtaking maneuver when, up ahead on the right, I saw a sign for a service station. An old sign. The light flickering, the fuel pump design almost faded. According to the GPS, it was the only reasonable stopping point for a good stretch of road. I decided to pull in, not out of real necessity, but out of an instinct to break the monotony of that night. I signaled, changed lanes, and took the exit. Meanwhile, the white truck continued straight ahead, without moving an inch from its lane, its red lights constantly flashing, showing no sign of reaction. I drove down the incline at the gas station entrance and felt the truck sway differently as its wheels left the perfect asphalt and entered the uneven, cracked concrete surface. The place seemed to have stopped in a time I couldn't pinpoint. There were old pumps with peeling paint, a small, low building with a restaurant sign, everything dark. No cars, no trucks, no noise of people, only the sound of my engine echoing in the empty yard. I turned off the truck and heard the silence fall on top of me like a lid. I went downstairs, felt the cold air hit my face, and walked to the restaurant door. The opening hours sign looked old, the plastic yellowed, the typography outdated. I pressed my face against the glass and tried to see inside. Chairs stacked on top of tables, a counter with a covered coffee maker, a jukebox tucked away in a corner, all in semi-darkness. It was the kind of scene you'd expect to see if someone had closed the place down a few days ago. But the amount of dust accumulated on everything suggested otherwise. I glanced back at the yard. At a glance, I swear I saw an outline darker than the surrounding area on the opposite side from the bombs near the barbed wire fence. It looked like a tall, stationary shape, a little denser than the darkness around it. I blinked. It seemed to have moved slightly, or maybe it was just my imagination. I didn't wait to confirm. I walked back to the truck at a pace I pretended was normal, climbed into the cab and slammed the door shut harder than I needed to. I started the engine, carefully maneuvered between the pumps, and returned to the highway access ramp. When the tires touched the asphalt of Highway 47 again, I had a strange feeling, as if I were crossing a line. I can't explain it. I only know that, a few minutes later, my rearview mirror showed exactly what I feared seeing. Up ahead at the same distance from me as before, the same white truck continued on, unchanged, its red lights drawing two fixed points in the darkness. I knew I had stopped at the gas station for at least 15 minutes. That truck must be many kilometers ahead, perhaps already in another county. But there it was, as if waiting for me, occupying the same spot in front of me, at the same speed, with the same impossible behavior. It was at that moment that I truly realized that something on Highway 47 didn't conform to what I understood as normal. As I continued driving, small details of the scenery began to repeat themselves. First, the crumpled trash can on the right side of the road, with a faded yellow stripe. Then a long dark patch cutting across the asphalt from side to side. Next, a fallen tree in the background, its twisted trunk forming a kind of arch over the undergrowth. I would see it, move on, forget it, and then see it again. Exactly the same details, in the same order. The odometer was moving forward. The clock on the dashboard was ticking. But the road outside seemed trapped in a noose. I resisted the idea for a while, because admitting it would be the same as admitting that I was lost not on the map, but in something else. Even so, with each passing kilometer, the feeling grew stronger. I started paying even more attention to the signs. One of them, crooked, indicating the name of a small town and the distance to it, appeared, disappeared in the rearview mirror, and reappeared whole again 20 minutes later. By the third time I saw it, the paint already seemed more peeling. It was hot inside the cabin, but I felt a chill creeping up my spine. I've driven through blizzards, storms, winding mountain roads that become break graveyards. None of that had the same kind of weight I felt there. It was as if the stretch of road wanted me inside it, spinning in circles, until I forgot there was a way out. I decided to pull over a second time, but this time with a different attitude. Instead of turning everything off, I left the engine running, hazard lights on, and mentally counted the time. 15 minutes stopped on the shoulder, looking in the rearview mirrors, waiting for any traffic light to appear, in any direction. Nothing. The feeling that the whole world had disappeared behind me and in front of me became almost unbearable. That's when I understood that staying still on that road was worse than continuing. It seemed that the silence itself grew heavier with time, as if the longer I stayed there, the more Highway 47 pulled me towards some place within itself. I engaged the gear and returned to the non-existent flow of traffic. I always thought the worst thing about driving at dawn was the sleepiness, but I discovered too late that the worst part is when you realize you're no longer just transporting cargo. The feeling comes on slowly, like a different weight on the steering wheel and an eerie silence on the radio, until at some point on the route you understand that you've stopped being a driver and become a cog in a machine you don't control. That night on I-10 crossing the Arizona desert, I had already passed that point without realizing it. The freight that brought me there didn't appear on the company's screen, nor did it come through a call from the freight forwarder. It was born in a corner of a truck stop diner, when a guy in a simple jacket sat across the table, knew my name, knew the model of my truck, and even knew which gas station I usually stopped at. He offered a side job, payment in cash, half up front. All I had to do was hitch a trailer in a yard outside the city, drive to a remote meeting point, deliver it for a few hours, and then return with the empty trailer. No invoice, no record, no questions asked. I knew what no questions meant. Nobody pays well to hide clean stuff. Even so, at that moment, I calculated the overdue rent, the bald tire, the timing belt that needed replacing, my mother's appointment scheduled, and no money saved. The offer hit me where it hurt and found its place. I left there with a wad of bills in my pocket, a new number saved on my phone, and the uncomfortable feeling that I had opened a door that wasn't going to close on its own. The loading yard was at the end of a dirt road, surrounded by old containers stacked like a makeshift wall. A man in a low-profile cap, glued to his cell phone, pointed to the correct trailer and gestured for it to come closer. The seal was already in place, dark metal with no logo. They wouldn't let me near the back. I hitched it up, tested the lights, air pressure, everything normal. The weight, however, didn't seem normal. The truck sank a little more on one side, and with each maneuver, the swaying was delayed, as if the contents took a second to decide which way to go. I left there with the feeling that the entire truck was watching me, the silent container behind me, the mirrors reflecting back a face I didn't want to see, the dashboard flashing common warnings that night seemed like comments. As agreed, I couldn't stop until the meeting point. No gas station, no shoulder, no detour. A clear line on the GPS from the edge of the city to a nameless place, near a little-used rural road. Night swallowed the highway as the city lights faded into the distance. The desert is a special kind of darkness. There are no trees blocking the view, no houses with lit windows, just that open emptiness where anything can be very far away or very close at the same time. I drove for almost 2 hours, seeing only worn-out signs, exits I couldn't take, and the steady glow of my headlights on the asphalt. That's when I noticed the car behind me. First, 2 small points of light in the rearview mirror, still distant. Then the uncomfortable constancy of someone neither overtaking nor moving away. The headlight always seemed to be stuck in the same place on the mirror, as if it were anchored to the bumper of my truck. I accelerated a little. It accelerated. I slowed down discreetly on an incline. It slowed down. It wasn't a coincidence. It was someone making sure I didn't suddenly decide to be honest. For a few minutes, I imagined that car belonged to the gang itself, escorting me. At other times, I thought it was the police, wondering how long they had been investigating the kind of operation I had gotten myself into in a single afternoon. The second hypothesis quickly faded. If it were a patrol car, they would have already ordered me to pull over. That was silent surveillance, the kind that ensures contract compliance, not law enforcement. Just a few kilometers from the exit indicated by the GPS, the feeling of being trapped intensified. The screen showed the route leaving the interstate and entering a secondary, unnamed road, towards an isolated spot near a dry riverbed. The satellite map revealed patches of light-colored earth, some scattered structures, nothing that resembled a city. Only that point, marked with coordinates sent by message, where I was being led as if I were as much a part of the cargo as whatever was locked in the container. I signaled, entered the exit lane, and felt the truck tilt as it reached the access road. The car behind did the same, close behind, obedient. When the asphalt ended and the dirt began, the whole thing shook, revealing once again the unbalanced weight. With each pothole, a muffled sound came from the rear, not of loose speakers but of a rigid structure vibrating, like metal stuck on rails. The dirt road led to a wide open space on the right, where yellowish lights already cast long shadows. A low shed, some pickup trucks, a dark sedan, 2 tall spotlights connected to a noisy generator. Nothing there seemed improvised. The ground was marked by tire tracks, fences were repaired, beams were reinforced. It was a base of operations, not an occasional outpost. I stopped where a man in a light jacket indicated with his arm. I engaged the parking brake and let the engine roar. 3 men were standing in the center of the yard. One of them, the only one with clean boots and dust-free clothes, stood out. He was the type who never touches cargo, only points. I climbed out of the cab, my legs heavier than usual. The car behind me parked sideways, partially blocking the exit. Another vehicle positioned itself near the front of my truck. I was the most replaceable person there. The man in clean boots extended his hand, not to greet me, but to receive the key. I handed it over. From that moment on, the truck ceased to be mine for a while, and I knew it. 2 men went straight to the back of the trailer. Another climbed into my cab. The metal seal on the container snapped as it was cut. The doors opened slowly. I was too far away to see everything, but close enough to smell what came from inside. It was an old, musty smell, a mixture of rust, cheap disinfectant, dried sweat, and something reminiscent of an abandoned hospital. My stomach reacted before my mind could even begin to explain it. When the flashlight cut through the darkness inside, the light found what I didn't want to see. It wasn't stacked boxes, nor pallets. It was narrow structures lined up in rows, fastened to the floor with rails. Thin metal stretchers, some with wide straps fastened, others with hanging chains, hooks, and sidebars. There were dark stains on the floor, splattered on the edges. In one corner, a chair with loose supports and belts. Next to it, unlabeled plastic boxes. I didn't see people, but their presence clung to everything. Every piece of metal bore the wear and tear of holding people who moved against their will. The idea of having crossed states pulling this thing without knowing hit me with physical force. The container hadn't been built to carry things. It had been built to hold bodies. The man in the clean boots realized I understood. His eyes scanned me quickly, cold, calculating. Another man approached with a cell phone, showed him something, and then turned the device towards me. The photo was of me, taken in broad daylight at another gas station weeks before. I was leaning against the truck, coffee bottle in hand, distracted. Behind me, almost the entire company logo. Someone had been observing me calmly, well before that delivery. I wasn't just any driver. I was a name on a list. The device disappeared into his coat pocket, but the message remained. They knew who I was, where I came from, where to find me if I ever decided to change my mind. They didn't need to mention threats. Having that image on file was enough. With that, I ceased to be a simple hired hand and became an accomplice tied with an invisible string. Without saying a word, the man in clean boots took a sideways step, opening a visual path from the cab to the road back. The gesture was simple, but clear. I could return to my place. I was still alive and useful. Perhaps I would still be useful more often. Perhaps it would be advantageous to have someone inside a common transport company that had already proven to be marketable. I walked back slowly, feeling my exposed back. I climbed into the cab, closed the door, and heard the rubber seal snapping inside, keeping the world out. The smell of dust and cold coffee inside competed with the odor of the open container. I started the engine obediently. Outside, the generator hummed, shadows passed inside the container, and the smaller truck approached to receive what I had brought. I didn't see the entire transfer. I heard the scraping of metal, the clanging of chains, the smaller truck being filled. Everything was quick, efficient, too organized for a first time. When they signaled for me to leave, the sky had lightened a little near the horizon, but it was still night. I engaged the gear, maneuvered carefully so as not to touch any vehicle, passed by the side of the yard and stole one last image. The smaller truck ready, pointing towards another dirt road. The man with clean boots standing in the same place, hands in his pockets. The car that had followed me repositioned near the exit. Nobody there seemed afraid of sirens. To work like that, with that calmness, it's because they knew exactly where the important eyes were and how to keep them looking the other way. I was just another indebted truck driver who had accepted an envelope at the wrong time. The dirt road back seemed even narrower. Without the unbalanced weight of the load, the truck responded better, but I felt heavier inside than on the way there. When I returned to the asphalt, the familiar world of the interstate seemed like a staged set. Illuminated rest stops, large signs, ordinary trucks continuing their journey. Anyone passing me at that moment would only see another clunker returning empty. I drove for a while until I saw a truck stop big enough for me to disappear into. I parked away from the pumps, locked the cab, and held the steering wheel for a few minutes without starting the engine. When I finally got out, my legs were still shaking. The noise of voices, equipment, and the television tuned to the news created an absurd contrast with what I had heard before. Just metal and a generator. In the bathroom, I washed my face and stared at my reflection. There was nothing special about it. Just another tired face, sunken eyes, a sun-stained cap. The kind of man no one remembers after passing him in some hallway. Even so, somewhere, that same face was saved in a file that would never be deleted. My cell phone vibrated while I was still near the sink. Unknown number, short message. It didn't mention my name, didn't talk about shipping, didn't mention a place or date. It only said that the service had been well done, that I was on their contact list, and that it was best not to mix that job with police matters. The last part was the only thing that needed to be clear. I returned to the truck with the feeling that there was no longer any neutral space on the road. Before that night, I could pretend that cargo was just weight as a number on the invoice. I knew stories, but they were always about other people. After that night, each unlabeled container and each unmarked truck bed carried another layer of meaning. I had seen how an empty space could be transformed into something that no one would ever admit to on paper. I kept driving. The bills don't wait, and a parked truck also costs money. I went back to my normal routes, went back to signing receipts, went back to talking about the weather, tolls and diesel prices as if nothing had gone wrong. But now, every different offer, every casual conversation in a diner, every lingering glance at a gas pump seems to hide something behind it. The man in the simple jacket didn't reappear, but from time to time I receive messages from numbers I don't save. Short phrases, almost always neutral, just to remind me that I still exist in some contact group. They don't ask for a reply. They rely on fear. On that stretch of I-10 where I first noticed the car following me, every time I pass by, I still feel my body stiffen. The desert is the same. The strip of asphalt is the same. The horizon remains empty. But I know that somewhere out of sight there's a dirt yard, a low shed, a generator ready to start again, a smaller truck waiting. And I know that if one day I decide to tell everything, they'll see me less as a victim and more as part of the machine. That's what that freight job bought from me. Not just a few hours of work and the use of my truck, but the certainty that, from now on, every kilometer driven also carries the possibility that someone, somewhere, will decide I saw too much. The road remains the same for those who pass by unaware, not for me. For me, the roar of the diesel will never again be just engine noise. It will be a constant reminder of the price they agreed to pay for my cowardice on the night an ordinary truck driver understood, too late, that he too can be part of a crime without ever touching a weapon. Irrevocable.